Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Abby Cabunoc. I lead Mozilla's developer-focused strategy around trustworthy AI and MozFest, and I'm also your host for today's panel on open source and the pandemic. So we have a vital discussion planned for today as part of our Mozilla dialogue and debate series at MozFest. We're going to unpack the intersection of the ongoing pandemic and open source, and discuss how open source technology and principles have been a potent force in slowing the spread of this deadly virus. So I'm really excited to introduce you to our three panelists today. So joining me, first we have Dr. Melissa Haendel. She's an innovator in open science collaborative analytics and leads a national COVID cohort collaborative, the largest collection of openly available electronic health data in the US. Melissa's vision is to weave together healthcare systems, basic science research, and patient-generated data through development of data integration technologies and innovative data capture strategies. Welcome, Melissa. Glad to have you here. Next, we have Ricardo Ruiz, a member of the Global Innovation Gathering Berlin Supervisory Board, which is an NGO dealing with innovation in the industry, public power, and people's daily lives all around the globe. Ricardo has been a consultant for IBM, co-founder and designer of 3Ecologias, an IT consulting firm for the environment, education, and culture. And he's also co-founder of Decentro, an institute of research in media, culture, and technology. Welcome, Ricardo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. And then finally, we have Dr. Netha Hussain. She's a researcher and medical doctor. She's been volunteering at the Wikimedia Foundation for the past decade. Netha's worked on articles related to medicine on Wikipedia and has recently contributed to several articles related to COVID-19. She's from India and now lives in Sweden. Welcome, Netha.
Thank you.
And one last thing, during this panel, we do want to hear all of your questions. So we're taking them real time. You can tweet them at Mozilla with the hashtag dialogues and debates. And the hashtag should be there on your screen. So please ask us all your questions. We'd love to hear them. So let's dive right in. So to start off, I'd love to hear from each of you just to describe how openness has been a part of your work this past year. So starting with Melissa, how has open source helped you facilitate collaboration and combat misinformation during the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Abigail. So I've been, really honored and pleased to really, help coordinate a very large community of over 2,000 people working together on health data in the United States. And one of the great kind of incentives, I think, in that context is that people are able to bring their own expertise and resources that they've developed in the open source community together to sort of be a best of breed approach to analyzing those data. So everything from knowledge artifacts to code workbooks to AI methodologies, really kind of bringing those together with clinical experts who have the deep questions around how do we combat COVID and help realize better care for patients. And so that it's been a very interesting process in terms of really incentivizing that sharing, but also in the context of public-private partnerships that really actually help foster those types of sharing. And so with the really sophisticated technologies that we've been able to leverage from the commercial side, we've actually been able to foster more open science by having those public-private partnerships. And so I think that's been one of the biggest realizations for me during this time is that that it really does take a village, and it takes a village from all different kinds of sectors in order to actually realize the goals of open science in such an expedient manner.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And that's amazing to hear how openness has really enabled that bridge, that public-private bridge that's often difficult to connect. Cool. And Ricardo, I'd love to hear from you about how openness has really helped you this past year.
Thank you, Abigail. I think not only this past year, but health is becoming more and more a software and a hardware problem because it needs more digitalization every day, And maybe we should stop building an economy around the knowledge that can save lives. So open healthcare makes healthcare available for people in countries where government cannot provide adequate healthcare, So there are now thousands of open source designs related to health and care from objects to create biolabs to open source COVID-19 test kits, prostheses, supporting equipment for daily life, and so on. So open source healthcare is also supported to develop a small business around its products, you know, no matter if it's dealing with data or hardware or whatever, you can create it as a small business in these different countries that I told. What I think is quite special in this open source movement in the design, in the health fields, that these designers and biologists, physicists, and makers, everyone involved in this are pushing for changes in patents for medicines and for vaccines, and trying to bring it, for example, just like Melissa said, bringing health data sets together and trying to launch them with open knowledge licenses, you know, and even promoting the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Open Healthcare, you know. So I think it's quite fundamental for healthcare, the open source movement.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Ricardo. I'd also love to hear a bit more about Caribous. I know you were awarded the Mozilla Open Source Support Award for this work. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, for sure. Caribous is a project we developed in GEEK, in the Global Innovation Gathering. That is how we can contribute with open source solutions for disabilities, people with disabilities, you know? And we have now around 10 or 12 labs around the globe, Nepal, Italy, Ghana, Brazil, that are supporting their communities developing these open source products, you know? We have now 2 years of experimentation with this program, and we could reach huge success because when the pandemic arrived, it looked like we've been training for it, you know? And when it arrived, we had a lot of labs in hand, a lot of products, ways of working with open source health products. And then Mozilla gave us support for the Brazilian community too. And with the support of Mozilla, we could reach, I think, 10,000 face shields to be distributed in indigenous community and traditional communities around the country. And also we created a model of an aerosol box that is something you should use it during the incubation process and the extubation process of patients, because they used to cough and then it spreads a lot of things around, you know. So it was a kind of question from a doctor that was leading a COVID intensive healthcare unit, and he asked us to develop this model because the model in Taiwan that was available was not that good, and it was open source as well. And we get from the model from Taiwan and developed this new model with a colored way to see it. And so it came from the doctor asked for a solution, and we said, look, we need a solution. We asked for Mozilla, and Mozilla, yes, let's support it. So it was quite intensive.
Thanks, Ricardo. That's so great to hear how you already had this system in place, or the infrastructure in place, and then you're able to take an existing model from Taiwan that was open source and then make it better and use your infrastructure to just distribute it around Brazil. So it's a great open source story.
Yes, thank you.
And then finally, Netha, I'd love to hear about open source and your work with Wikipedia.
Yeah, for me, openness, it's a way of life. And I try to share as much of the work I do openly, because I believe that there is someone in some corner of the world who benefits from the knowledge that I share. I don't know who that is, but there is someone who always benefits from it. So it's not only the medical data that I share on the internet, but also my paintings, my code, and everything else that I've created during my lifetime. So that is why I said that openness for me is a way of life. Secondly, I believe that being open is essential for making a collaborative project successful. So if you're running a collaborative project surrounding knowledge, then you need to be open for bringing in more participation and developing on the project. And I volunteer with Wikipedia, which is the world's largest encyclopedia and the biggest collaborative open knowledge project that humanity has ever built. So this work of building up an encyclopedia together with like millions of people around the world speaking different languages, it sounds very exciting to me. And this is why I keep volunteering to do this work. And on the other hand, I'm also a medical doctor. And right now I work in a primary care center where I see a lot of COVID patients among other people. And I'm particularly worried about the misinformation that is circulating on the internet. And when the pandemic started in February, March last year, I was particularly moved on reading the story of an Indian family who ate a poisonous fruit, thinking that eating that might help them prevent being infected with COVID-19. So they were misinformed from the internet and they followed that fake information and they became seriously sick. So it really moved me, and I wanted to do something in my capacity to be able to counter the misinformation that is circulating on the internet. And in my profession as a doctor, it was being hard for me because my patients were confused about what kind of practices are evidence-based and what are not. And people had their own ideas about what might prevent them from getting COVID-19 and if they are affected with COVID-19, what kind of medicines help them from cure them of the disease and so forth. So I wanted to do something for their sake as well. And thirdly, we live in times where even the past president of the United States of America shared fake news related to the pandemic. And now people are losing trust in our institutions. And another phenomenon that I see now is that truth is behind paywalls, but lies are free. So if you want to have like trustworthy information, you have to pay for it, but you can see lies all over. So this paywall content that is only accessible for the privileged. And I wanted to make as much truth accessible for people for free, which is why I write on Wikipedia, particularly about COVID-19. And this possibility of sharing free knowledge with millions of people around the world in languages that they speak is very exciting, and which is why I started contributing to Wikipedia 10 years ago, and I keep doing that even today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Netha. And that's I love that, well, I don't love it, but that idea that like the truth is behind paywalls, but lies are free. And just thank you so much for working hard to get that information out there for us, as widely as possible. So thank you for all your hard work for the past decade, and especially this past year.
Thank you.
And I think that's a nice segue into my next question. With groups like Caribous and Wikipedia, it's really inspirational to see all these giant communities mobilize to do whatever they can for the pandemic. So starting with Ricardo, how is it possible for volunteer contributors to accomplish more than these traditional closed institutions?
Whoa, I was muted, but look, from my perspective, diversity amplifies knowledge. So when you bring together patients, doctors, designers, makers, biologists, whatever, to work together for the common good, you boost the possibilities of finding excellent solutions to real faced problems, So to reach this success in co-design, you should rely on open source knowledge and to also release your designers, their designs with open source license, So in this way, you, just like the open source software movement, you get an advance from the industry, That's the reason big industries are going for free software. Because you got an advance, you have the whole community of the road to support you. So the idea probably would be better than a small team of 1,000 people, So I think in health relates to software, and in many fields of life, open source is important because it's the way we live.
That's great, Ricardo. Netha, did you want to weigh in around Wikipedia?
Yeah, definitely. So when COVID-19 happened, it took a while for everyone to make sense of what was happening and what was going on. And traditional institutions, they were struggling to reorganize their strategies and cope up with the new normal. And many institutions also had a tough time to make their employees work from home and collaborate digitally. And they also had a very hard time combating misinformation. And if they had done a good job of like preventing misinformation from circulating the internet, we would have had much less misinformation on the internet today. So it was also difficult for many institutes to process the huge volume of research data related to COVID-19 and make sense out of it. So Wikimedia projects differ in this perspective. For open movements like Wikimedia movement, the infrastructure to deal with this kind of emergencies was already in place. So we have hundreds of thousands of volunteers around the world who speak 300 plus languages and share information not only in the form of text, but also as images, videos, code, structured data, and books, just to name a few. And Wikipedians previously have institutional memory of having dealt with a emergency. So Wikimedians have previously collaborated to share knowledge, starting from the 9/11 attacks in 2001 to the recent farmer strike in India. So this 20 years of institutional knowledge of collaborating online, an army of several thousands of volunteers, participation of experts and researchers, and internal mechanisms to combat fake news and vandalism, ability to quickly respond to changes and push out new updates in a matter of seconds. So all these factors together contributed to Wikipedia responding to pandemic in such a fast way. And it became the source for knowledge for millions of people. And this is a kind of thing that traditional closed institutions cannot do in times like a pandemic or an emergency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Netha. And going a little bit off script, it's interesting hearing from both you and Ricardo how you already had this infrastructure. Wikipedia has this big infrastructure, Caribous had this big infrastructure, and you're ready to strike when the pandemic hit. But Melissa, I think you had to build that infrastructure, and that's a lot of what you've been doing this past year.
Yeah, and I think one of the most exciting things is that so in the U.S. And I think this is true in most countries. Healthcare data is very sensitive and private for many different reasons, and there are many different regulations to keep it that way. But there are also private arrangements with commercial organizations to mine that data for drug companies and drug development and all kinds of different things. But the open science research community has really had very poor access to those data. And not only do they have poor access to those data at any individual site, because there's poor access to those data across the nation, there's no ability to really do research on those data as a whole, right? And so one of the amazing things that happened in our National COVID Cohort Collaborative, or N3C, is really that all the institutions signed regulatory agreements to push all of their data into a shared, secure infrastructure, where we were fortunate enough to already have some infrastructure in place at NIH that allowed us to securely house those data. And then because of our smaller communities' expertise in data harmonization, we're able to work with each individual institution, and we're up to 82 institutions now in the US that have signed on to share their data. It's an unprecedented level of sensitive data sharing in the United States. And it really, really has taken the village to create that harmonization infrastructure. And what we've also realized in doing that is the healthcare data is really 1980s level informatics, because it's been hiding behind these firewalls for so long. We could be doing so much more if the research community actually had access to it. But cleaning it all up and making it useful for AI and machine learning types of applications has been a huge lift and a huge kind of open science endeavor by the community. And I think one of the challenges is we've made it broadly accessible to the community for research, assuming that you have human subjects training and your institution says you're not random bad player off the street. There's definitely some regulatory hurdles, but we even have high school students working on these data together with machine learning experts from commercial venues. So it's really very broad participation. But this sort of tension between how do we make it broadly available with the right training and the right security, but we also want to be able to share things out of that environment. So being able to publish our code and our knowledge artifacts on GitHub openly, but recognizing that people cannot run that code without having jumped through all the right security and regulatory hoops in order to access the data. And so I think that's where we're seeing the village in action, but we're still sort of trying to maintain privacy and security requirements, both for legal reasons, but also for ethical ones. And at the same time, we're doing the work as openly as possible. And the workflows between those two arenas is uncharted territory. Like, how do you push reproducible code out and know that it's reproducible if you can never reproduce it outside the environment of the clinical data? So these are some of the interesting kind of open science tensions that we're running across in that context.
Yeah, that's amazing, Melissa. And I didn't realize you had high school students accessing this data. That's really exciting to see that it's that open and it's that accessible.
We don't let them see the row level data.
Okay, yeah, that's
we don't see individual patients, but they can access some of the synthetic data and some other artifacts. So yeah, it's a little more careful than just that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's still very exciting, and that's a huge accomplishment, getting that kind of infrastructure up. And it's a little sad that it took a pandemic to get that going, but I'm so glad it's there now.
Me too.
Yeah, and for the next question, actually on a personal note, I think some of you know that I am a new mother. There's a 1-month-old in the next room being silent, hopefully not going to be crying soon. But I was pregnant for most of this pandemic. And it's really interesting, as I was reading about your research and the work that you're doing, to see how, like Netha, you were writing articles on COVID-19 and pregnancy. And N3C was really enabling a lot of pregnancy-related research with COVID-19, along with other kinds of insights. So my question, I think I'll start with Melissa again. How do you ensure that the work you're doing benefits not just majority of the people, but also the smaller and more vulnerable populations affected by COVID?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So, the N3C was launched originally by the Centers for Translational Science Award sites, which are essentially in the US the kind of largest, most significant academic medical centers, and those communities have a broad community outreach component to them. So one of their primary functions is actually to serve in their regional areas, partner organizations and disadvantaged communities. So that was part of it. And then we also partnered with the IdeaState CTRS, which are these smaller, more rural health-oriented clinical institutions around the nation, as well as other rural healthcare organizations like OCHIN, which basically just trying to find philanthropy and other funding to support the sort of non-academic kinds of clinical organizations to participate. And so that does two things. It makes sure that the cohort, the people that we have in our data set, and we're up to about 3 million patients now in the system, is representative of all Americans, that we necessarily have good representation. So we can look at things like environmental health factors or rural health factors or social determinants of health to really look at those patterns at a scale that we've not been able to look at in any of the individual regional kinds of initiatives, where we are seeing a lot of disadvantaged populations being more severely impacted by COVID. But we can really validate some of those conclusions at a scale in the US that we've not been able to before in the US. The other thing that effort to sort of find philanthropy and other funding for all those kinds of organizations does is it also enables those organizations to participate in the data analytics. So we give them training and join them up with other groups to help them learn how to use the data so they can answer the questions that are most relevant to those communities themselves. So it's teaching to fish, so to speak, and that's been really wonderful too, because the kinds of questions that those communities have are very different than the kinds of questions that a premier academic medical center, clinician researcher might have. And so, again, that it takes a village to kind of really, poke at these data from all these different angles, but getting people to work together to help each other to answer those kinds of questions. And so, for example, we might have one of the more prestigious academic medical centers asking questions about their city population in terms of demographics. But those same kinds of methodologies can then be ported to looking at rural healthcare questions And so the people who have done those analyses on the urban areas can then say, well, what do we need to adapt or evaluate the same or differently in these other contexts? So they're really learning from each other from these different viewpoints. And so I think the sort of, the folks who are maybe a little bit more sophisticated on the informatics side, maybe don't have the same kinds of questions that a rural health or disadvantaged population might have, but they have the expertise to share. And so that's really this sort of knowledge transfer that's been happening and in both directions. And so that's been a really wonderful thing. I want to conclude with just one thought about, really being careful about our tribal data content, and also just making sure that that's like, there's a real balance between viewing that information about those kinds of sensitive demographics in a way that helps them versus actually stigmatizes them. And so some of the decisions that we've had to make about whether we share that information or not, even if we have it, have really tilted towards being more protective of those types of information and really working with those communities to decide how they want to view that information, and maybe coming up with some infrastructure strategies that allow them to look at it, but not the whole world. And so those are some other nuances that kind of are at the intersection of ethics, infrastructure, and just sort of data access control that can allow us to configure things specifically for specific populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's great how, because the data is open, these populations can learn to fish or can have access to it. Even though there's a lot of still data control issues involved. Netha, did you want to talk a bit about Wikipedia's work in marginalized communities?
Yes, definitely. So I think that in any part of the world, the worst damage from crisis occur to people who are left out from structures of power and privilege. So disinformation is naturally mostly targeted at these vulnerable groups, and they are more likely to believe in them because they have lack of access to institutions and trustworthy sources. So on Wikipedia, for example, there is an article titled Misinformation Related to the COVID-19 Pandemic, and it is present in 37 languages. And the main article about the COVID-19 pandemic, it is available in more than 150 languages. So I think that having information shared in as many languages as possible is important because the most vulnerable people of the world don't necessarily speak or understand English. On the other hand, I also personally try to, when I write articles on Wikipedia, I personally try to see the perspectives of the vulnerable communities. And I try as much as possible to include the perspectives of women, people of color, and people living in the global south in the articles that I write. So for example, I wrote about mental health issues during COVID-19, about COVID-19 and pregnancy, and social stigma related to COVID-19. And these are some of the articles that I started on Wikipedia, which could relate to the vulnerable populations. And sometimes it's not even enough to share this information online because the most vulnerable do not have access to the internet. So several Wikipedians are involved in bringing offline versions of Wikipedia to countries affected by war, poverty, natural disasters, and censorship, so that they too can have access to knowledge even during times of crisis. And another project the Wikimedia Foundation has been working on is like developing the mobile version of Wikipedia, because many people from the global south and many are coming to the internet right now, and they are using their mobile devices as their primary source to interact with the internet. So if they have to have a good experience of interacting with Wikipedia and learning new things from Wikipedia, we need to provide them a good platform on their mobile phones and not just on their desktops. So these are some of the things that the volunteers on Wikimedia as well as the Wikimedia Foundation are considering when it comes to thinking about vulnerable populations.
Thanks so much, Netha. And I'd never heard of offline Wikipedia before. That's amazing. And that would be huge.
Yes. We also have this project called Wikipedia in a Box. So you basically get sort of a USB drive, and it can be shipped to your address. And many schools and universities, even universities in different parts of the world, they have this Wikipedia in a box, and they can use it offline. Yes.
That's really cool. And I know, Ricardo, I didn't put your name under here, but I know you care a lot about public power in the Global South. Did you have anything to add around, helping the more vulnerable populations?
First of all, I love the idea of Wikipedia in a USB driver, you know, it's, whoa, mind-blowing and really important. I think we should always try to focus on the last ones, you know, the last ones to take vaccines, the last one to get access to hospitals and things like this. And the way we can do it now, for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic, is protection, you know. So this was something we had in mind when we were developing products in Caribous, Brazil. I want to protect myself, you know, but in a fashion way. So we developed, for example, the Black Lives Matter turbant. So it was a turban where you have a face shield inside of it, very beautiful, with beautiful clothes on it and textile, sorry. And we also developed, for example, hats for Rastafaris with some things like this, and hats for children and things like this, because we need to support the last ones, you know. Just like Melissa said, all this data available. This data is, she's dealing with a community in the United States, but you can grab tons of data from Nigeria, for example, and who is taking control of that, you know? So, and I believe the open source movement, saying like that, is key, you know, it's fundamental to protect rights. Because if health is dealing in a proprietary way, who will take care of that product, of that data, of that vaccine? You know, what do you have inside the black box? Inside the USB driver, I know there is Wikipedia, and I trust people there. And every day I know someone that writes to Wikipedia, you know. So very nice to meet you as well. You know, it's always good to know there are people behind it, Netha. But sometimes behind these big companies, you have exploratory labor behind. You have, you know, people are not working by heart and things like this. But so, yeah, that was my point.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. And I think we've touched on this a little bit as we've been just talking. But Ricardo, going back to you again, what would you say to people who think that healthcare is too high risk for open source development?
I would reply that healthcare is a too high risk for proprietary development only. You know, because we should care about ourselves. We should care about the ones we love. We cannot give our health to other people to take care of it, and you just don't care, you know. You go there to your doctor, okay, back home, I'm fine, I will take this medicine. We should care for ourselves and for the ones we love. And so I trust more in my community, for example, developing a carryable product that fits my needs than a small manufacturer somewhere around the place with a cheap labor, you know. And we also, Melissa, mind-blowing your job. We should care about your health data, protections from risks of monetization, you know, and control of this data. Paul, I live in a periphery of the road. How many people are dying? What is happening? Where is this data going to? What the Ministry of Brazil is doing with this data? What the University, John Hopkins, you know, John Hopkins has all the data. So we should care about that. And when, for example, we share all of our designers or approach, I will call Melissa's work as a designer as well, because, you know, it's, but when you share these things of what you are working with, you create multiple platforms so people can communicate and understand the risks of keeping giving your health to other person to take care, you know. So, okay, I play, in Brazil, we have this kind of health security plans that you pay monthly, and you pay that thing, go once a week, once a month, once at 6 months, and you don't make an exercise, you don't use you don't wash your hands, you don't, you know. We, during COVID, we learned that we didn't know how to wash our hands, and we didn't know how to clean ourselves because we moved crazy to toilet papers. Gosh, you know, we don't know how to care of ourselves. So I think this pandemic brings this knowledge to us. And I think open source is the answer for that. How to care of yourselves. How Melissa's grandmother used to care of her, sorry, how Melissa's grandmother, or how Nadia's grandmother used to care of her grandmother. They share knowledge, you know, they share knowledge with neighbors, they share knowledge with everyone, recipes from that we had of herbal medicine for thousands of years. And even these medicines, the pharmaceutical industry is using this knowledge, and it's get patents and create an economy over a knowledge that used to be public. Whoa! No, so at least I think this, maybe this open source movement, all this we are doing now in the health sector with the open source, can bring some glimpse of knowledge about ourselves to the whole world, you know. We should care about ourselves in a greater scope, you know. We should care about our data, about our neighbors, about everyone. We are living, straight up your mind, we're living in serious times.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead,
quick.
Melissa. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Ricardo. I think there's a couple things you said that really just resonated. So when Netha said, you know, the truth is behind paywalls, but lies are free. You know, I think the same thing is, you were speaking about the literature and sort of social media, but I think the same thing is true with healthcare data. So we're able to sort of make these arrangements with commercial organizations to share that same healthcare data with them, for them to discover how to find the drugs and find the patterns in the data, but not with each other and with the with citizens, right? And so the same thing is true there as well. And so the second thing I guess I want to say is also, as a patient, you know, I at least in the US, I'm very frustrated. You know, Big Brother knows everything about where I am from my phone. They know about my credit history. But when I go to the doctor and they say, sign this form so that we won't share your health data, and I say, I'd like to sign the form that says you're going to share my health data, they say, we don't have that form. It's like, I'm not allowed to share my health data, but all these other systems are in place to know everything else about me. So we really are thinking about it, I think, in the wrong way. And maybe a lot of that has come about because of discrimination for pre-existing conditions and the way that we provide healthcare and insurance in the United States in particular. And there are, of course, sensitive privacy issues that you may wish to not have be revealed to the public sector. But at the same time, how can we live in this environment where we share everything about ourselves all the time as a constant data stream, and yet have zero access to information about our healthcare data? And so then the third point I wanted to make that also really resonated with me with Ricardo's comments is just the patient needs to own their data, not other people. And we need to tilt towards a world where the patient is in charge of who has access to which parts of their healthcare data. And when we can tilt towards technology that support that will enable all kinds of different things in both the public and the private sectors.
That's amazing, Melissa. Thank you. And just a quick reminder before we move on to the next question that you can ask your audience questions for everyone watching using the Dialogues and Debates hashtag on Twitter or in the comments in the YouTube stream. So yeah, I think I'll go on to our next question. So with open resources like Wikipedia and N3C, how do you balance openness with so many conflicting views and harmful misinformation? Netha, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. Yeah. So I touched upon some of the points earlier, but I would like to emphasize on that. So one of the things that we jokingly say about Wikipedia is that it doesn't really work in theory, but it somehow miraculously works in practice. So if you like sit down together and brainstorm about an encyclopedia where anybody can edit, you might think that no, it's not a good idea, but it kind of somehow works and somehow works very well. And how Wikipedia works is because of many reasons, and one of them is its robust policies. So the policies on Wikipedia make sure that everyone has to back up their information with citations, and if you do not have adequate citations, that information might eventually get deleted from Wikipedia. And when it comes to medical articles, only those information which the highest level of evidence is allowed to be presented on Wikipedia. So it's only the systematic reviews and meta-analysis that should ideally be on a medical article and not just junk science or like links from a news article or something else. And like I mentioned earlier, the Wikimedia movement also thrives on its army of volunteers. And it's quite hard to explain how like hundreds of thousands of volunteers contribute their like several productive hours to build up an encyclopedia. I really do not know what motivates people to do that. But then there are very many generous-hearted people who really contribute to Wikipedia and make their article, keep its articles updated. And these volunteers are the main gatekeepers who watch the recent changes that is happening on the Wikimedia, and they revert the harmful changes. So if somebody goes in and makes a bad edit on an article, there would eventually be another goodwill volunteer who comes back and reverts that edit. Another thing is that these volunteers are also helped by scripts called bots, and these scripts are trained to detect blatant vandalism, like suspicious keywords and links to suspicious websites. So these bots, they will like notify a volunteer or change the version if they see that something bad is going on. So there is also some support from the technical side to help volunteers to combat misinformation. And there is also a process on Wikipedia to protect or semi-protect some of the high-profile pages from being edited by unregistered users or less experienced users. So if it's an article about, say, the COVID-19 pandemic, it cannot be edited by just about everyone. You need to earn sufficient privileges, or you need to have a registered account on Wikipedia to be able to edit such high-profile articles. So I would say that it's the combination of volunteer work, technology, and robust policies that keeps most of the misinformation away from Wikipedia. Yes.
Thanks so much, Netha. And I know, Melissa, with your work, you're dealing a bit more with conflicting views rather than misinformation. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think, one of the, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, one of the really nice advantages of having so much data is being able to look at studies that were done earlier with smaller amounts of data to see if we actually see the same kinds of results. And similarly, like there were a number of really high profile scientific retractions that were made in Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, where there really was no access to the data. And those retractions actually changed, clinical trials that were underway for, important drugs. And so I think, just having the full reproducibility and transparency of all of the data, can really sort of say, hey, this is a justified study. Here's all the data that shows why it's justified before the studies begin. And then also for studies that have already been done on smaller populations, being able to say, how does this scale? How does this relate to what we've learned from this much larger amount of data? And, in some cases, we've actually seen, some differences in some of those from those smaller studies. In other cases, it's really reassuring to be able to justify those results. So I think it's sort of the power of the size, the power of the data to be able to justify and to validate results as they come out. The other thing I would say too that's actually really interesting is that there's really a lot of effort on the sort of computational biology side of the world to kind of look for drug candidates to target the SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins and to try to understand the mechanisms of action. And one of the things we're really trying to do is to use those kinds of approaches together with the clinical data to validate the trials so that we actually have more evidence of the potential impact on the clinical outcomes by using that computational biology approach together with the clinical informatics. So instead of saying, here's the top 25 drug candidates, we only have money for 10, let's just, try to prioritize them, actually using those data together to also sort of validate approaches for designing trials. So I think it's more about validation and justification in our case than it is misinformation.
Thank you, Melissa. And it's good to know that these systems are in place so we can trust the information that we're getting and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So we did get a question come in on Twitter from C. Rapunzel, and I'll address this to Netha. Has it occurred to anyone that an offline Wikipedia already exists as encyclopedias? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's right. Like once upon a time, we did have like paper encyclopedias we really religiously had on our bookshelves, but I don't think many people have that practice anymore. And because of the entrance of Wikipedia into the internet, we do really have like many of the encyclopedias which used to be in the paper format, they do not have their print versions anymore. Now everything is going digital. And like Ricardo mentioned in another channel is that, look, now your encyclopedia doesn't have to be like a paper version. It can also be a USB that sticks in your pocket perfectly. And you don't need to carry such volume of big books, which are quite expensive as well. And another reason why I started contributing to Wikipedia was also because these books were very expensive. So when I went to my first year in medical school, my textbooks were really prohibitively expensive, and I had to go to a physical library to be able to access it. So I decided at that time that the kind of knowledge I have, I want to be able to share it on the internet for everybody to see. And that was how I started contributing to Wikipedia. So yes, I have nothing against the paper encyclopedias, but given its limitations, I think that it's time that we invest more in digital platforms, including collaborative projects like Wikipedia.
Thanks, Netha. And if anyone else has questions about paper encyclopedias or anything else that we've discussed, please use the Dialogues and Debates hashtag, and I will be sure to answer that. But I think our next question, and I think this will apply more to Melissa, who did a lot of infrastructure setting up, is can the open source systems and community you've set up for COVID-19 pandemic help us be more open in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the really exciting things about the work that we've done is, we had this just incredible regulatory partnership between the institutions and our government agency, the National Institutes of Health. And those regulatory arrangements to cover the transfer of these data, were designed solely for COVID. So you cannot use the data in the system unless you are studying COVID. So you cannot do Alzheimer's research with these data. That said, there's a lot of information in there that, if you're studying the effects of COVID on Alzheimer's patients, you would be very equipped to do so. There's a lot of data about a person. It's their entire, sort of largely de-identified, but, a lot of different parts of the medical record are there. So, if you have Alzheimer's, we're going to know which Alzheimer's drugs you're on and which, how far along in your trajectory you are, for example. So there's a huge potential for, being able to broaden this type of infrastructure to be able to serve all kinds of different disease research areas. And I think, this was obviously, these regulatory arrangements were made in the time of a public health emergency, but now, following, the better part of a year of really having very secure, very safe access to these data, I think the institutions are realizing that we can do this, and maybe we can do this for all the disease areas, and especially in certain kinds of disease areas, such as rare disease research, which is really my background and interest, where any given institution never has enough patients to glean anything useful from. By having, the whole nation's data, you can actually start to find other patients that are similar, and start to understand patterns of care and patterns of outcomes for those patients in ways that you cannot do in a single institution. So I'm really excited about the idea that, the community is starting to talk about, wow, this is really cool. How do we advance this for all disease areas? Similarly, with the next pandemic or the next new disease to be discovered, in the face of a new disease, there's a really deep need to more deeply characterize and classify patients so we can understand what are the specific subgroups. So for example, in COVID, we have a 10 to 30%, depending on estimates, of patients, of COVID patients have long-term sequelae from their acute phase of the infection. And these types of symptoms really vary in their duration at the different time points after their infection and in the different body systems that are affected. And so by having, it's a new disease, there are actually, really fundamentally many different subtypes of what we call long COVID, and how we actually care for the patients that are in each of those subgroups should probably differ. But until we have enough data in the face of a new disease, we don't know what those subtypes really are well enough to design those treatment and care strategies. And so, I think that's a great example of just, and this is true for the rare disease or any kind of new disease that we start to subtype as we get more information about how to classify patients is really important for care considerations. So in the long term, we're really excited about the idea that maybe we could really endorse this idea that we could do this for for all disease areas for clinical and translational research.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I think that that really resonates with me. I started my career at a cancer research institute, and it was exciting to see these large data sets of like cancer data, but then heartbreaking that it was only used for cancer research. It could have been used for a lot of other things. But it's exciting to hear that we're moving forward slowly. Netha or Ricardo, did you have anything to add around open source in the future and what this could mean?
Yeah. Yes, we can go on.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
Sorry. All right. Sorry, Netha. I heard Ricardo, but right quickly, if we think in the 2030s and the 2040s, the 2030s and 2040s, where we will have a lot of biofermented food, we will have a lot of new materials developed from scratch, and all these kind of things. All these things will be proprietary, We will have proprietary foods, proprietary sources of protein, proprietary materials. And if we believe in a future where we can live as an equal community, we need open patents, license, softwares, and whatever. So I think I believe this COVID movement, the open source, was really strong and very helpful. And I really hope we can move forward for larger open source struggles, Sorry again.
Thank you, Ricardo. Netha, did you want to chime in?
Yes, one lesson that the pandemic has taught me is that the collaboration is the way forward, and I'm sure Melissa will. I resonate with Melissa in this case that most of the important research related to COVID-19 happened because the scientists share their findings openly and build international collaborations to share and analyze their data. And people around the world, they gathered information about COVID-19, not only from textbooks, but they mostly read websites and Wikipedia. They read about it on the internet because it was a relatively new disease. There were no written books about it. So everybody had to go into the internet to know about it. And the research surrounding COVID-19 progress so far, including vaccine research, because there was a lot of collaboration between international collaborations between scientists. And this kind of collaborations are only possible only when you share data between research groups. And I think this idea of sharing in order to build bigger collaborative projects has really sunk into the academic world. And this is going to continue in the future. So I think that one of the lessons that pandemic has taught us is that collaboration is really the way forward.
Thank you so much. And we have 5 minutes left in this lovely panel. So I do want to close this off with a little bit of a call to action for our audience. So I thought we could go around and each of us can say how others who are watching now can support you in your work. Netha, did you want to go first?
Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is changing the world in a way that more and more people are now using the internet and subsequently Wikipedia to learn new information. So there is recent research which shows that the viewership of Wikipedia increased manifold during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially during lockdown periods in the respective countries. So I think that it's therefore important to keep Wikipedia up to date and reliable, because lots of people access Wikipedia as their first source of information. And therefore, my call for action for everyone is to start participating in sharing your knowledge freely and openly on the internet, including on Wikipedia projects, so that you can help people with the knowledge that you have. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Netha. And yeah, people can do that by publishing blogs, I guess. They don't necessarily have to edit a Wikipedia page if they're scared still.
Yeah, there are lots of possibilities, but I believe that people should share the knowledge that they have.
That's great. Ricardo, how can others help and support your work?
Well, in Caribous, we are part of these labs that I told you, innovation hubs developing, promoting, and manufacturing open source healthcare solutions. So on our site, caribous.org, one can find hundreds of open source design models to support people with disability, and more dozens of available designs to use against COVID infections and things like this. So take part on caribous.org, or any other open source health projects near to your community or one WhatsApp away from you, and start to share, just like share your knowledge, share your possibilities, show that you can share care, and share your care.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I think I was pronouncing Caribous wrong before, so I apologize. But yeah.
I think you are pronouncing much better than I, I have this accent from the subtropics, the famous Savage English.
But it's, I know my friend, he has a 3D printer, and early in the pandemic, he was just printing off the mask holders so that it's a little bit easier on your ears for the healthcare workers who have to wear the masks all day long. And it's great to have resources like Caribous where you can find templates for things like the face shields you were talking about and those aspirators, along with like mask holders. So yeah, huge props to the work you're doing.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone in Mozilla and everyone in the panel. Thank you very much. And Audrey in the backstage.
And finally, Melissa, how can people watching support you in your work?
Thanks. I think maybe a couple different ways. One is I actually just love this idea of like, how do we get knowledge about our clinical data as we're revealing patterns and findings in these large data sets into places like Wikipedia? Like, how do we better move knowledge about biomedicine into, or sort of conclusions about biomedicine into knowledge? How do we do that faster? It takes a really long time to change care guidelines and to deploy things in clinical settings. But I would love to see some work. So if you're a biomedical person and a Wikipedia person, maybe we could have a chat and think about how do we push some of our findings into the knowledge space, so it starts to become part of the fabric of what people understand more quickly than we have been. So that was just one idea that I had. The second thing is really just please join the N3C. Everyone is welcome. We were very fortunate to allow foreign participants as well. So it really takes many different kinds of expertise to make it go. And so we would welcome everyone's participation. And then finally, I think if you work in pharma or in sort of, commercial healthcare context, really, think about how you might want to leverage this public community of practice for analyzing these data in a collaborative fashion. We have some really great pharma participants who've been really learning a lot alongside our open science enthusiasts. And it's really, I think, this handoff of like the learning, revealing the secrets of the data, and then handing it off to commercial entities who can take it and run with it and develop therapies quickly with that foundation of open science and collaboration. Like, we need to think of the commercial partners as really key partners in how we do this. And some of us who are much more deeply on the open science, translational science side of things are less equipped to understand the best ways of delivering that information and those partnerships to the commercial partners. So I guess I would have a call to action to pharma and other commercial partners in the biomedical domain to partner with us and help us learn how to cross that divide more quickly.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And just really quickly, how would people join the N3C?
I will post a link on Twitter.
Okay, so you can go and check Melissa out on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle, real quick?
Anto Wonka.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. That's the end of our time today. This was a lovely discussion and really inspiring around open source and pandemic. And I'm really hopeful for the future and what we can do. So thanks so much to my three panelists, Melissa, Netha, and Ricardo. And thanks to everyone watching at MozFest. And with that, I think I'll close us off. Bye, everyone.